I'm totally creating this on the fly, so I have not thought about specifically what the design would be, and so the background color is just going to be something very light, and card header H1. I don't typically write in CSS, so you're going to see me make a lot of mistakes here. So the card header H1, we're going to say a margin of 0. And inside of our header, let's do a padding of 1 rem. Let's do 1 all around. So that gives us a padding on top and bottom and on left and right. So that's just gonna, you know, at very small sizes is gonna be like here. That's like an iPhone 5 or 4. So that's a very small size phone. So I like to bring it out to maybe 375 or so, because that's gonna be your sort of mid-range. 400, 450. You're starting to get into the bigger phones at that point. And that's probably it for now. I'm just going to do sort of a basic card design. You can make the cards look like whatever you want to. Card content. Not going to do a lot here. Just going to add a little bit of padding also. So just 1 rem all around, maybe a half on top and bottom. And what this does is, excuse me, it just gets it away from the edges, you know. Just without that, it doesn't look very good. So you can see right here is everything is sort of scrunched up, and you get vertical margin there on the top and bottom because this P element has a natural vertical I think it's 1.5 rem on the top and bottom, 15 pixels or something. Okay, and now we need to style our footer. So I'm going to make our footer a little bit darker color than this. So we'll say card footer. And the background color is going to equal maybe A. So a little bit darker in the footer. And then we'll make each of these navigation card footer items, we'll make each of these a white color. So we'll turn them white, and now we need to use our Flexbox. So we're going to use Flexbox. So this is the grid item here, our footer, and then inside the grid item we're going to set a flex item. So that's going to be card footer nav, and we're going to set that to display flex. And what I want the actually let's go ahead and set up our menu. Really, it's list style. We'll just get rid of the bullets and the padding. We'll get rid of the padding. Okay, and it might even be okay to just get rid of the margin. So we'll get rid of some of those things. And then we'll say we'll put the padding on each individual element. So we could say padding of 1 rem, and that gives us a little bit of space there, but the padding is on each element instead of on the actual unordered list. So it may not look different, but when you get into it, if you wanted to do some sort of hover effect on these, now you have sort of a button kind of look that you can do. So we have our flex item, or our flex container, and that's this card footer nav. And now we need to, this is just flex start, that's the default. and we want to stretch this out all the way across the available space. So right now it's just sort of sticking to the left hand side. In order to make it go all across the space, we need to justify content, and we use justify content because we haven't changed the direction. So the default direction that we're going to flex items is going to be a row. Now you could flip it so that you're manipulating the distance or the space between items on the vertical. And if you do that, you say flex direction is column, and then justify content handles the y-axis. Okay, so it gets a little confusing. The default justify content is the x-axis, so horizontal, and then align items is a vertical. If you flip it and you say flex direction is column, if you flip it like that, then all of a sudden everything is a column. The default direction is a vertical, not a horizontal. Okay, so justify content in that regard controls the y-axis, and then align items controls the x-axis. So if you make this change here, it flips the justify content and the align items. Just one of those things you have to just kind of get with Flexbox. So we want to do the default. We want this to be a row. We're only going to flex the items along this row. And the first one that we should try is space between. And what space between does is it takes the first one and puts it up against the very left edge of the container. It takes the last item, puts it against the very right edge of the container, and then it spaces everything else in between evenly between those 2 points. And we can also use space around. And you can see here that it provides a little bit more space on the first and the last one, because what happens is it evenly spaces these out and then takes the extra and puts it on the edges outside of the icons. So the extra space goes here, not here in the in-betweens. So essentially you have the same amount of space around each of these. Okay. And then if you wanted them to all be at the end, you could say flex end like this, and then that would push them all over to the right. And remember that with media queries, you can change all of this configuration depending on the screen size. You can make them look or behave differently. So let's just go with space between. Okay, this is the one I'm commonly going to use. It gives us a nice, especially if you need a nice left edge here. You see this left edge. It's nice and crisp, and then it fills up all the space all along. Okay. I told you if you wanted to do a rollover, you can do that. So let's just copy this. And we'll say on hover. Then what we're going to get is a background color of that. So when we roll over it, you can see that there's a little bit of padding around each element, right? Now that may not be exactly what you're looking for, but that's what the padding around each of them allows you to do. Okay. All right, so now we have our card. It goes way too wide. So at some point we're going to have to allow our grid to come into play. So this is just going to be the basic card structure. Actually, let's do a little bit more to the card itself. Remember, we're kind of working outside in. So the card, we're going to give, let's do a border of 1 pixel solid and just a very light gray border that you can't see very well right now. and then we'll give it a border radius of 5 pixels. And so now we can't see it very well because we need the card grid to be something. So let's just put a little padding on the card grid just so we can see what's going on. Okay, and so now our grid has a little bit of internal padding, and we can see, you know, there's a very nice, neat little border. Maybe that needs to be a little bit more. Just so we can see the card itself. Okay, so we got our border for our card. We have a card header, and this looks like, you know, a card that you might see in a design. So what we're going to do is we're going to reproduce this card because we need to have multiples. So I'm just going to copy that and paste them down. 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So we have our cards here. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. I don't want 7. I just want 6. 6 is a good number. 6 is divisible by 2 or 3. So you can, excuse me, you can actually make for a little bit more varied card size. If you have 9, then if you go down to 2, it starts to get a little wacky. So anything with multiples of 6 is going to be good. 6, 12, 18, 24. If you have a grid that's those numbers, then you can get 3 across, and you can get 2 across, and you can get 1 across. So it sort of hits the breakpoints really well. If you have to do 4 across or 5 across or whatever it is, then, you know, you just have to figure that grid out for yourself. I'm not going to worry about the space between them necessarily because we're going to use our grid spacing in order to control that. So now that we have all of our cards, can we just do this so we can see them all? Okay, so we have our card grid and we have all of our cards, and now we need to create our grid structure. So at small sizes, I'm still going to apply CSS Grid, so we'll say display grid, but we want the grid template columns to just be 1 FR. Now that's going to take up all the available space, but everything is just going to be in one column. It's not going to separate them out into multiple columns. And then we can use our grid gap in order to control the spacing. So grid gap controls the spacing on the internal parts of our grid. Notice that it didn't create any spacing up here outside the grid or over here. It only created spacing between the elements that are inside of the grid. So only spacing between these elements on the internal parts. So that if you go real wacky with this, you can see that it only creates internal space. There's no external space that's being created here. So that's the power of grid gap, to be able to control the spacing in between. We can use grid row gap is the same thing as whenever there's only one column, then you don't necessarily need to specify grid row gap because that's the only gap there is. There's only one column, so there are only rows. If it was two columns, now you can see that our gap between the rows is big, but there's 0 gap here. So if we just remove this, then we're going to get 12 between everything. So you can see again, there's no outside space being created. It's only internal space. So that creates, using grid gap, creates a uniform structure. If you want to do 2 different kinds, so we want the rows to be 2 rems, but we want the column gap to just be 1. Let's actually say grid row gap is going to be 1, and grid column gap is going to be like 4, something where we can see there's a difference. Okay, so you see now there's a big space between the columns, but there's only 16 pixels of space between each row. Okay, so that's how these two things work in conjunction. Using grid gap creates equidistant gaps in the columns and the rows. So, so let's just get back to where we were here with grid gap. Okay, that was sort of a preview of coming attractions, but we have everything looking really nice right here. So this is our basic our basic card structure, and it's in a grid form already. So all we have to do is at the breakpoints, we just need to control our columns. So I feel like maybe for like when you get around here, everything's starting to look a little cramped or compact. We could create more space here by controlling the size of this text. We could try to control the size, the padding or something like that here to create more vertical. But I think at 500, we'll just go ahead and split this into 2. You can already kind of see where two would fit well on the page here. So we come down and we create our media query. So we say app media and the minimum width of 500 pixels. Then we're going to do whatever inside here. So let's just copy this, and we don't need everything from this declaration. We can take out these two things because they're going to cascade down. I'm going to leave the grid gap, so I'm not going to change that, but I want this to go to 2 columns. So now you can see that we have 2 columns, and we have 2 rem of space in between. And it's a little tight here, so if you were doing this, you'd probably want to manipulate the top. But it doesn't take long for it to, to do what it's supposed to do. But for the sake of design, I would probably change that. And so now you see you have this nice 6 cards, 2x3 design. And then again, you just sort of are trying to get a feel for at what breakpoint is it going to feel like, okay, we're getting a little too much here. There's too much space. There's too many things going on. Even here, things are starting to space out a little bit too much. And so let's say at 900 pixels, then we're going to make another shift. And let's just copy this media query. And we say at 900 pixels, let's do something else. Now let's do 1FR. And now we're going to have a 3-column grid. And then our 3-column grid is going to continue out. And let's say right about there, 1100 pixels, we're just going to set it. So we're going to put a maximum width on this card grid of 1100 pixels, and then we'll just margin out the sides to auto, and then it'll stay centered on the page or inside the section or whatever you want it, wherever you want it to be. Before I do that, we're using this structure here where we have like column 1, column 2, column 3. If we wanted to change those columns, we could. So let's say the middle column, we want to take up more space than the outside columns. You can see that we run into some issues here if we try to do that, but I'm just trying to show you that each of these declarations controls the width of the column. We can also write that with a little simpler notation, just by saying grid template columns, and then it's called the repeat notation. So we say how many columns do we want? We want 3. And then how wide do we want them to be? We want them to be 1FR. And this is a totally legit way to write the same thing. But this is really helpful if, let's say, you have a 12-column spread or 6, and they're all going to be the same size. They're all going to take up the right amount of space. or the same exact amount of space, then that makes it super easy because you don't have to just write one FR, etc., and then keep track of those things whenever you're doing your media queries. You can just write these repeat notations. Could do the same thing here. And instead of 3, we would say 2. And then when we come down to our sides, you can see that we have our 2-column spread, and then down to 1, right? So it's the same way to write the same thing, or it's a different way to write the same thing. I find myself doing both at times. Sometimes I'm only thinking, like I did here, I'm only thinking about 1 FRs, especially if it's 2-column, 3-column. It's not that big a deal. When you start to get into 6, 8, 10 columns, then it becomes a lot easier to just use the repeat. You can also put a min-max on here, so you can say in the minimum that it needs to be is this amount. The maximum is going to be this amount. So you can actually control the spacing of your grid cells. Okay, so we have our cards in place. Let's put in our maximum width. I'm just going to put it straight here on the first declaration. You could put it at whatever breakpoint, like you could say at 1100. I want the minimum width stuff to kick in. I'm just going to put it right here. The maximum width. I'm going to say max width is the 1100 pixels. And then I would say margin of auto. And now when I come out, let's see, we're at 1000 now. And then you can see that it stops growing, right? And it centers itself on the page. So it's going to get out to a maximum width of 1100, which is still a good look for our cards. It's not too wide or too spread out, or they get too unwieldy, right? If you wanted your cards to look more like that, then you could set it, a maximum width of 1000. And then they look a little bit more square. So the sort of preference, how wide do you want it to be? How wide is the rest of your website? There's a lot of things to consider. So if we look at that in our regular mode, you can see that it goes only to 1000 pixels wide, and then it stops, and then it centers everything. So margin auto just says keep the same amount of space on this side as this side, okay, and the same amount of space here as here. So sometimes you'll see people control the vertical margin with like 20 pixels or something on the top and bottom, and then margin auto on the sides, and that sort of gives you the spacing that you need. Okay, so hopefully that is clear about how to use Flexbox along with your CSS Grid. They do fit inside of one another. Now I want to show you one last thing. So if we, you don't always have to use Flexbox. You can use Grid inside of Grid too. So where's our Flex element? So instead of this, I'm going to copy this and I'm just going to comment it out. Now, we don't have, well, it's Flex now. So right now we have our regular block level, because these are all list items. So a list item is a block level element. So they all take up their own line. They push the next one down to the next line. And which is why we have to use Flexbox in order to put them side by side. You could also float them or something like that if you wanted, but that's sort of the old way. And if you want more control over your elements, then you can actually do a grid inside of a grid. And so we would set these elements to display grid, and then we say grid template columns, and we just take however many items we have. We have 4 items, and I'm just going to say repeat for 1FR, and then each of those items is going to take up its own amount of space. Now, where this might be helpful is if you need to control the space a little bit more. Like if you want more control over the space somehow. Let's say let's say you have two of these that also have some text, right? So we're going to say pay online, and we're going to say check. Let's just say stats. And then this one says pay. So you can see here, this is okay, but if you get anything more, pay online, it's going to sort of break the design because it's only taking up, remember, it's all taking up the same amount of space. But clearly, these two items need to be able to take up more space than the other two items. Now, to do this with Flexbox, you're going to have to control the spacing of each individual item, which means you have to put an actual width on each of the items, the flexed items. With Grid, we can just control the column width. And the way that we do that is we're going to have to use individual columns here. So for our last two, we want them to be auto and auto. Be able to type. So that means these two are only going to take up the space that they need to take up. And for the first two, we're going to say 1FR and 1FR and hope that it works. There you go. Okay, so now you can see that we've recreated our structure. So these two are taking up only the space they need with their padding. Remember, we put a little one rim of padding around them. So they're taking up only what they need. And then these two are sharing all the rest of the space. So it starts like right here and goes all the way to here. And these two are basically saying, I'll take half of whatever is in here. So if we had more here, then it would take up, it would still get what it needs to get. So you can see that we're creating some uneven columns here, and we really didn't do anything except control the column structure. We didn't have to actually touch the width of these items. Now, if you use Flexbox, you're going to have to actually touch the width on each individual item, do a little math, that kind of thing. So if you want to avoid that and you have sort of a simple situation like this where you don't need necessarily to control exact widths of columns, then doing a grid inside of a grid instead of using Flexbox inside the grid might be the way to go. So for me, Flexbox is great when you don't really need to control the width of each item. You can do that if you want to. It starts to cause problems with breakpoints and things. That's why I don't like to use it. But when I want more fine control, I'll pull out CSS Grid. So for some people, maybe they don't like using Grid for just a horizontal or one axis. I don't mind using Grid inside of Grid. It's not a problem. Not an issue with the code itself. You can do that. So hopefully that gives you a little bit of sense of how you can use Grid inside of a grid and how you can use Flexbox inside of a grid as well. And so you can use the grid sort of as your superstructure. You could have even we could have even set up grid for our card, and so each of these elements is a grid item as well. So you can do all kinds of grids inside of grids inside of grids, and it's not a problem with the way that the CSS is handled or compiled by the browser. So go out and grid it up, and we just didn't need it here because it was such a simple structure. But we could have easily, if we had something inside here, we could have easily used CSS Grid inside of there to control how elements are spaced out inside the main content section as well. I've had to do that for some different designs. All right, if you have any questions, hopefully this answered a lot of your questions, but if you have any more questions or comments, just leave them down in the comment section below. Remember to hit the subscribe button to get notifications of new videos when I release them. I'm like most of the world. I'm working from home, so my audio setup isn't quite what it is at work. So hopefully this didn't go too badly. I have a nicer microphone now. And hopefully this isn't too bad of a setup for you. You can see everything pretty well. But leave a comment if you have it. Hit the subscribe button. An easy way for you to support me is to just click that thumbs up. It doesn't cost you anything, but it really helps my videos. And if you have any suggestions for future videos, feel free to leave that. This was coming out of a suggestion and from some things that I've seen just from the web development community, especially on Reddit, people asking questions about how these two things fit together. I understand both of them, but how do I do them together? So hopefully this brings some clarity. If you want more CSS Grid videos or Flexbox videos, you can look. I have some playlists. So if you want to learn the basics, or there's some examples in there as well, or how to build a whole website with a grid superstructure, I have a website or a series like that as well. So just dig around through my channel, see if there are things that can help you in your journey. And I think that's all I got for now, and I will see you again next time.